Welcome to another Classic Car Club drive-through. This is the Ferrari 488 GTB. We've had every generation Ferrari since 70s 308 GT4. All amazing cars, all come with the ups and downs of a Ferrari, and a lot of them have left me with no desire to ever own one personally. But I'll always say that, Ferraris, especially, at the level they are now, they shake you in ways that no other cars can. And when you get a chance to experience it, the right roads and the right conditions, they're absolutely amazing. They do things that no other car can deliver. But having lived through maintaining and owning and, the torture of Ferrari ownership, I'd be happy as a member, I can get in and drive it, not have to worry about all that stuff. Ferrari 488, was a bit controversial. It marked the end of the naturally aspirated V8 motor in Ferrari's flagship sports car. They're also kind of hypercar level now. And Mike and I went to the launch of this in New York, and I have to say it was a little weird and kind of sad. They had the car at ground level in a giant room where no one could see it, and they had the presenter was an engineer explaining the odd math behind the way that they had a smaller displacement motor and still used a larger number for the model designation, and just kept talking about the sound, almost apologizing for the fact that we were going to be losing that high RPM, naturally aspirated song that Ferrari is so well known for. With that, people, when they did finally get a look at the car, they're like, where's the motor? It was tucked so far down you couldn't see it. There was a lot of cynicism around the launch of this car. And I kind of took that with a grain of salt. And then I eventually drove one, and I'm like, you know what? I'm not gonna, maybe I'll miss the sound. Maybe I'll miss the sound at the higher RPM, but they've made a better car for a lot of reasons. So this is a 3.9 liter turbocharged V8 that replaced the whatever it was, I guess a 4.6 liter in the 458. And the way they come up with that 488 designation is the amount of cc's per cylinder. So they found some number relating to the engine that was more than 458, so they call it a 488. It's 488 cc's per cylinder. While you stuck a couple turbos on there, you brought that red line down, hampered that high RPM wail that Ferraris are so well known for. You did get an extra 100 horsepower for it, and even more significantly, about 160 foot-pounds of torque at 3,000 RPM. Whereas the 458 peak torque was around 6,000 RPM, and the claim was, well, you still get about 80% of it at 3,000 RPM, but way lower than this. And the reality is, if you're not on a racetrack and you're not running to the red line every time, what you really need to motivate the car and get moving is torque at the low end. So for a car that is admittedly a street car, I think the low-end torque is pretty helpful, and it makes a really enjoyable car to drive. While it doesn't have that high-end wail, it makes a really nice grunty sound that I've come to appreciate. And the whole car, compared to the 458, just felt a little more sorted. The front end felt a little more planned in. That's a pretty long intro. I can probably save some of that for when we're actually out driving the thing. But there's a lot of story here to get into, because the move from this naturally aspirated motor and the muffling of the signature Ferrari exhaust note just brought on a lot of talk that needs to be run through and clarified. Now we'll get in, see what it's like to actually drive. So we're inside the 488. If you've driven a 458, all this stuff will be familiar to you, but let's run through it for those who haven't or haven't seen that video. Start button, most of the kind of driver controls are on the steering wheel. You have your foot firmly on the brake. Hit the start button and it'll fire up. So Bluetooth works, not bad. I'm just gonna flip the AC on so Bob and I don't boil here. That's all pretty basic, kind of funny looking controls, but you pick your temperature, put it on auto, let it rip. The important bit for getting out and driving this car are all these controls in the steering wheel. So you have the Magneto switch, which they've had for a few generations of Ferraris. You're mostly going to be playing between sport and race. If you do get caught out on some damp roads, wet will help. It will keep the revs down, keep the torque delivery down, keep the traction at the max. No need for CT off or ESC off. This car has a lot of power, a very sophisticated traction control and stability system, and you're not going to gain anything with the traction off other than a steering wheel full of drama trying to keep this car planted. Remember, you've got 661 horsepower, and I think it's something like 560 foot-pounds of torque. It is so powerful. You want those drive aids there to help you keep this thing on the road. That said, the difference between sport and race, sport is going to be, exhaust is a little quieter, and it holds the point where it opens up and gets louder to a higher RPM. Throttle response is tuned down and a bit smoother, so if you're in traffic, it doesn't get too jumpy. If you go to race mode, throttle response is quicker, could be a bit jumpy in traffic. It also tightens up suspension, and is going to open up that exhaust earlier, so you have that kind of louder exhaust note, which is kind of nice. In either mode, you can use this button, which is the bumpy road button, and I highly advise it for most of the roads we drive on. I'll talk about it when we get driving here, but we have a bit of smooth road, and then halfway through it gets pretty chunky. I put it on even though I'm out here. Definitely use it in the city, anywhere. But even on the back roads where it's nice driving roads, you want that compliance in the suspension to keep the tires connected to the road. A lot of people that are kind of catalog bench racing their cars just buy all the heavy dutiest, stiffest, highest performance suspension parts and throw them in their car. And then they've made their car kind of unusable for their conditions because they don't live on a racetrack. So we're not at the test track at Maranello, we're on the real roads in New York, where we have winter and frost heaves and potholes, and you want compliance. So I use it as much as I can. This button toggles it on and off, and when you switch modes of the magneto switch, it goes back to whatever the suspension mode is for that magneto mode. I'm gonna stick it on race mode and see what that's like. I'm still gonna hit the bumpy road button so I have some compliant suspension. Let's see what we got. Frighteningly quick. I wasn't even, much past half throttle on race mode, so I still have quite a bit of traction. And you may have heard the engine RPM dancing around a little bit. That was because the traction was cutting loose, even when I was at half throttle pulling away on a pretty nice warm summer day with dry roads. So, definitely gonna be mindful of smooth inputs in a car like this. You have so much power at hand that it's really easy to overwhelm the tires and get yourself in a situation where you've lost grip, lost control, and are careening off to the trees and boulders on either side of the road here. Well, these things are capable of sort of violent acceleration. I think the real joy is getting a rhythm going, working right through the gears, kind of finessing the car through the road and enjoying the variety of the dynamics as you brake ahead of a corner, dial in some steering through it and dial it back out. Really try to work on smooth inputs when you're driving really anything, but especially in a car that has this much power at hand. You don't want to be punching the throttle, stabbing at the brakes, or ripping on the steering wheel. You want to be smooth and deliberate with your input. So anyway, that said, wow, yeah, it's really good, this car. I was a big fan of the 458. The very first one we had was this beautiful Pozzi blue coupe. And it felt like Ferrari had kind of grown up, with a magnet ride suspension and that bumpy road button. It felt like Ferrari was really appreciating that this is a road car and they should design it to work on the roads their customers drive on, rather than giving the no sacrifice race car interpretation of it. Well, I loved especially that first 458. The second two we got were Spiders, and I did not love those much, and I'm not sure how much of that was the little slightly more creaky, twisty chassis with a Spider. And I noticed only in those cars, and it may have been there and I just didn't pick up on it in the coupe, that right around that kind of sweet spot where you're finessing the car, sort of 3,000-4,000 RPM, there was like a kind of jump in the throttle response, and it made it really hard for me to drive the car smooth. Front end is definitely a bit more confident than the 458 as well. I do think they went to a wider tire, which they did on the on the 458 Speciale, but I think they brought that over to the base model, the 488. I can, appreciate the wail of the high revving naturally aspirated motor. I really like the way this one drives. So now we're coming up on the second part of this, one of my favorite roads in Bear Mountain. They haven't paved this for a bit. It's pretty craggly, and I'm going to put the bumpy road mode on so we can kind of take advantage of that magnet ride suspension and give some compliance, which is great. Now we're still driving through the curves here. It's a magnet ride suspension. It's a bit of a black magic carpet. It smooths everything out, keeps the tires in contact with the road. So still way too fast. And again, I was only about half throttle, and I got up to about 6,000 RPM out of a 8,000 RPM red line. You'd have to have a lot of open road to explore the limits of this car. The great thing is it's really enjoyable in that kind of mid-range finessing, going through the gears and feeling all the dynamics. For my kind of wrap up here, like I said, my intro to the 488 was not great. It's just it felt like a big apology from Ferrari, trying to talk away the fact that they were getting away from naturally aspirated motors and convince people that smaller was better by coming up with a bigger number to define the motor and the model designation. But that was they did a disservice to themselves in that, and in the end they made like a really great car, and it is an improvement on the last one, even if it doesn't have that signature sound that they were apologetic about getting away from. And I think they've actually kind of come around to themselves. In the F8, the one that's the next iteration of this, different looking body but still built on the same chassis and same drivetrain, they've embraced their turbocharged heritage. They actually call the F8 Tributo, which is a tribute to the F40, the last really famous turbocharged Ferrari. So I think now they've come around. They don't have to be apologetic about it anymore, and they can embrace it. And in the end, they deserve it. They've made a better car. So grab yourself some free time. Make sure you get some nice open road and some good weather, and get out and enjoy it.